occupied France in 1944, was a landscape of shadows and slow terror. In the basement of 84 Avenue Foch in Paris, a Gestapo interrogator loomed over a captured British agent. The tools of his trade lay ready: pliers, electrical wires, a bathtub for simulated drowning. He had time days, even weeks, to prize every secret from the mind in front of him. Safe house locations, radio frequencies, drop sites, names that could unravel entire resistance circuits. Experienced interrogators understood the limits of the human body, but they also understood its eventual breaking point. The Special Operations executive in London understood this too. That is why, hidden in the corner of the prisoner's shirt collar, invisible even to a careful search, was a tiny rubber-coated capsule, no larger than a garden pea. Inside it rested a thin glass ampule filled with concentrated potassium cyanide. One deliberate bite would shatter the glass. Within minutes, the agent would be dead and every secret would die with him. The interrogator did not know this. He knew, in the abstract, that prisoners sometimes carried poison. German leaders themselves would later rely on cyanide at the collapse of the Reich. But he did not know that Britain had engineered, refined, and systematically issued a device that transformed suicide from desperation into controlled, deliberate silence. This was not panic. It was strategy. The capsule was not merely an escape from torture. It was a final assertion of authority, a refusal to let time and pain extract what loyalty and discipline could not surrender. This was the L-pill, a weapon unlike any other. One that existed not to kill the enemy but to deny the enemy victory over the living. Captured agents faced a fate that few could endure indefinitely. German security services operated a network of interrogation centers across occupied Europe, but none were more feared than the building at Avenue Foch. There, under the direction of SS intelligence officers, prisoners were broken not only by pain but by precision. The most dangerous interrogators were not sadistic brutes, but professionals who understood that terror worked best when combined with uncertainty. Prisoners were confronted with photographs of comrades they believed safe, shown intercepted messages in their own handwriting, and offered cigarettes and coffee alongside quiet promises of humane treatment. Truth and deception blurred together. When psychology failed, the escalations were merciless. Beatings were routine. Prisoners were strapped to chairs and shocked. They were submerged again and again in bathtubs until their lungs burned. They were deprived of sleep for days until reality fractured. Some were hung by the wrists until their shoulders dislocated. The point was never just pain. It was inevitability. Sooner or later, the body would betray the will. The mathematics of capture were unforgiving. A single agent under interrogation could compromise an entire region in a matter of hours. One name could lead to 10 arrests. 10 arrests could become 100 within days. Months of careful recruitment, training, and coordination could be erased in a cascade of betrayals that no bravery could halt once the first confession emerged. The collapse of the Prosper Network in 1943 illustrated this with devastating clarity. Hundreds of resistance members were captured after a handful of operatives broke under pressure. British planners knew that even the best training could only delay, not prevent, such outcomes. An agent might resist for 2 days, perhaps 3, but no human being could withstand unending, professional torture forever. Britain's answer came not from doctrine or tradition, but from a secret industrial estate in Hertfordshire known as the Designated Station ICs, requisitioned before the war and later handed to the newly formed Special Operations Executive. It became a workshop for weapons that polite warfare did not acknowledge. Under strict military discipline and scientific leadership, engineers and chemists devised tools intended not for open battlefields but for darkness. Explosive coal to sabotage locomotives, incendiary briefcases that ignited when tampered with, and silent pistols for close, unseen killing. It was here that one of the most intimate weapons of the conflict was born, not a gun or a mine, but a pill. The challenge was unlike any the engineers had faced. The device had to be lethal, small, and entirely under the agent's control. It could not kill by mistake. It had to survive beatings, falls, cold, moisture, and the stress of clandestine life. And it had to act quickly once used. The scientists settled on liquid potassium cyanide sealed within a fragile glass ampule. The glass was deliberately thin so that it could be shattered by the pressure of human teeth. Around it they molded a soft rubber coating, usually brown or gray, both to protect the glass and to prevent accidental poisoning. If the capsule were swallowed whole, the rubber would usually pass through the digestive tract intact. Death required intent and unmistakable decision. In that sense, the design was as much psychological as mechanical. There would be no accidents, only choices. Once bitten, the effect was swift and unforgiving. Cyanide halts the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level, inducing a kind of internal suffocation even as the lungs continued to draw air. Unconsciousness could follow in moments. Death typically arrived within minutes. If the ampule was crushed and absorbed directly, the terror was brief. For men and women trained to face gunfire, arrest, and torture, This brevity mattered. It was the difference between an end and an ordeal. Manufacture and concealment became as important as chemistry. Production was handled at a separate facility near Espionage that already specialized in covert munitions. Tens of thousands of hidden weapons passed through its workshops. The L-pills were small enough to be sewn into almost any garment. Male agents often had them hidden in shirt collars so they could bite through the fabric. Female operatives concealed them in hems or within accessories. Some were disguised as coat buttons. Others were hidden inside lipstick tubes. Later myths would speak of cyanide hidden inside hollow teeth, but this was fantasy. The capsule was simply too large for such a purpose, and historians have found no credible case of poison concealed in dental work during the war. What Britain had created was not only a device, but a quiet contract. Agents were not ordered to use the pill if captured. It was offered as an option. They could decline it without shame. But for those who accepted it, the knowledge changed the balance of power in the interrogation room before the first question was asked. Capture did not have to mean betrayal. Pain did not have to become confession. The final decision belonged to the person in chains, not to the one holding the instruments. Several documented cases reveal how this promise played out. One of the clearest comes not from a British operative but from a senior figure in the French resistance working closely with British intelligence. In the spring of 1944, this officer was betrayed by a double agent and arrested at a train station in broad daylight. He carried with him a staggering amount of information: the identities of resistance leaders across multiple regions, radio frequencies, arms caches, escape routes, and the operational picture in advance of the coming Allied invasion. He knew exactly what awaited him at Avenue Foch. Rather than allow days of torture to extract what months of planning had built, he swallowed his cyanide capsule on the spot. He died within minutes. The Germans disposed of his body without ceremony. The networks he protected survived. His choice saved others at the cost of his own life. Other cases followed similar patterns. An agent captured on a train in 1942, discovered with radio equipment, shot his way free long enough to swallow his capsule before being overwhelmed. Another officer used his pill after betrayal later in 1943. Each case followed the same bleak logic: death chosen instantly to prevent the slower deaths of dozens or hundreds. These were not acts of despair alone. They were acts of containment, sacrificial decisions, made in full knowledge of what interrogation would produce, yet not every agent could bring themselves to use the pill. One captured resistance figure, held for weeks under severe torture in the same Parisian cellar, eventually threw himself from a fifth-floor window to his death rather than submit further. Whether his capsule had already been confiscated, or whether psychological barriers prevented him from biting, it will never be fully known. What his case illustrates is that controlled suicide, even when rational, remained an immense human hurdle. Training could prepare the body for pain and the mind for lying, but the final act still demanded a decision that no doctrine could make easy. Some agents never had the chance. One renowned female operative fought until her ammunition was gone during a firefight in southern France in June 1944, overwhelmed before she could reach the pill sewn into her clothes. She was later transferred to a concentration camp and executed months afterward. In another tragic story, a wireless operator of exceptional bravery endured months of imprisonment, chains, and repeated escape attempts. Accounts differ on whether she ever accepted a suicide capsule at all, as her personal beliefs may have conflicted with the idea of taking a life, even her own. She was eventually executed in Germany. The pill was never a guarantee. It was only an opportunity. What is striking in the surviving German records is not what they reveal, but what they do not. There are no clearly documented, formal Gestapo directives specifically addressing British suicide capsules. This absence does not mean the Germans were unaware of the risk. They certainly understood cyanide, and their own leaders ultimately relied on it. It does suggest, however, that there was no reliable, systematic countermeasure. Searches could sometimes uncover hidden capsules. Psychological tactics may have been adjusted to prevent prisoners from acting too quickly. But there was no perfect defense against a weapon that required only a single second of resolve. Even the most powerful figures of the Third Reich would ultimately validate the effectiveness of cyanide as an instrument of final control. At the war's end, senior leaders used concealed capsules to avoid capture or trial. In one notorious case, a captured Nazi leader crushed his cyanide ampule during a medical examination, dying within minutes despite frantic efforts to save him. The same chemistry that silenced resistance agents now silenced the architects of the regime that hunted them. The concept did not remain uniquely British for long. American intelligence organizations developed comparable devices during the war and refined them in the early Cold War. Later, investigations revealed stockpiles of cyanide capsules and even more potent toxins intended for covert use. But these were continuations of an idea first fully realized in Britain: that denial of information could be as strategically decisive as the destruction of enemy forces. Despite its psychological power, actual use of the L-pill remained relatively rare. Most captured agents did not swallow it. Some hoped for rescue. Some believed they could endure without betraying others. Some simply could not confront the finality of the act. Memoirs from SO veterans describe the pill as an optional extra, accepted quietly, sometimes refused without comment. Yet even when unused, its presence mattered. It reshaped the mental landscape of captivity. The interrogator's leverage rested on the assumption that if enough pain were applied, the prisoner would eventually speak. The pill broke that certainty. Time was no longer guaranteed to work in the interrogator's favor. Today, one original cyanide capsule rests in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London. It is catalogued in clinical language as a glass ampule of liquid compound cyanide concealed within a modified cartridge case. Visitors pass it daily, often without grasping the moral and psychological weight compressed into that tiny object. It is easy to describe it as a suicide device, and technically that is accurate, but it is also the physical embodiment of a promise that an agent abandoned in hostile territory would not be stripped of all control, that even in absolute captivity there remained one decision that belonged to them alone, and the interrogation room. The dynamics of power appeared brutally when the prisoner was restrained, isolated, exhausted. The interrogator commanded the environment completely. He determined when pain would begin and end, when sleep would be granted, when hope would be offered and withdrawn. He controlled the physical reality of the cell. What he could not command was that private moment when teeth might close on a hidden capsule. No threat could prevent it. No promise could undo it once the decision was made. The ultimate authority over silence lay not with the state that tortured, but with the individual who chose when to die. British engineers did not attempt to solve the problem of interrogation with armor, weapons, or battlefield victories. They solved it with chemistry, concealment, and a stark acceptance of human limits. They acknowledged that no training could make a person invulnerable to unlimited suffering, but they also realized that giving agents sovereignty over their own end transformed the psychological equation in ways the enemy struggled to counter. The pill did not make agents braver. It made their silence absolute. No comprehensive German response to the pill has yet surfaced in surviving archives. If countermeasures were discussed, the records have not endured. What remains is the evidence of individual decisions made in train stations, prison cells, and alleys across occupied Europe. Decisions made in seconds, shaped by months of preparation and an unspoken understanding between agent and country. Each use extinguished a life. Each use preserved many more. The legacy of the pill is not measured in how many people it killed, but in how many networks it protected from collapse. It denied the Gestapo a certainty they relied upon above all others. The belief that time and pain would always prevail. Against torture, Britain offered no shield that could stop blows or electricity or drowning. Instead, it offered something more limited and more profound: the power to choose the moment when suffering would end and secrets would remain secret. In the basement of Avenue F, the interrogator believed he possessed all the tools required for victory. He had the instruments, the training, the patience, and the legal immunity to use them without restraint. What he did not possess was control over that final, private act that belonged to a capsule the size of a pea, hidden in cloth and rubber and glass, carrying a dose measured in milligrams. In that tiny object lay the quiet defiance of an intelligence service that understood the darkest arithmetic of espionage and devised one last answer to it. The pill did not win battles. It did not liberate cities. It did not turn the tide of the war in any dramatic, visible way. Its influence was invisible, measured in silences that never broke and operations that never unraveled. It represented British innovation at its most intimate and unforgiving. A weapon whose battlefield was the human body, and whose purpose was the preservation of trust under conditions where trust should have been impossible. In the end, it left German interrogators with leverage over flesh and nerve, but never over the final choice. And in that narrow space between life and death, British intelligence secured something that even the most sophisticated terror could not steal: the last word.